everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Coach and Benway podcast. I am your co-host, Dr. Benway. Coach is here with me, and we're here to talk about the Civil War. It feels like we've been leading up to this conversation for a while.
Yeah.
With my talk of doom and gloom of the United States, but I had convinced Coach to at least in part watch Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, at the very least for shits and giggles, because he got a kick out of the Vietnam War documentary. So, Coach, what'd you think of the documentary?
Well, I actually didn't finish it. I watched until the fifth episode, until the Battle of Gettysburg. I just found it too slow. And frankly, my commitments in terms of my real world commitments are such that I just could not devote that much time to it. You know, you and I talked about it just before the show started. You were saying that you have to savor it like a fine scotch, right? But sometimes what happens is that you just, nowadays, you get to a point where you have too many commitments. And I tried to watch it over what's been at least a couple of weeks that we had talked about watching it and discussing it. So what happened was I just found it quicker to read about the Civil War and brush up, because I'd already read about the Civil War and I knew enough about it that I was not going to be lost. I found the documentary itself, I found it interesting. I thought Shelby Foote was a very compelling presence, and I can see how he could become so popular. But all in all, the Ken Burns documentary seems a little thin, you know. Perhaps at the time it was more impressive because it came out in 1991, I believe. But now I just didn't find it that big of a deal. I don't know. You tell me. What do you think?
Well, I disagree with you. Of course, I just think it's impossible to describe it as slight. I think it really captures in a time when the sort of trend, especially then, and it continues now, to move away from kind of narrative history telling. Was a pretty strong force. The fact that it would come in and say, you know what, I am going to do 15 hours on this subject. Thank you very much. And I am going to take the time. I am going to imbue the energy of this period with the narratives of the actual individuals who wrote about it and the historians who researched and spoke about it. Makes it very compelling. I think it's a rich experience as a result of that. I think if you don't have the time commitments to give to it, perhaps it says more about the world we live in, that we don't have time for such things, than it is about the documentary.
Hang on. Let me walk back some of my criticisms, because you're right. Okay. I suppose what's happened is that since the Civil War, the documentary by Ken Burns, there have been so many filmmakers who have done something similar, who have followed in Ken Burns' footsteps. I mean, hell, you know, on my Mac, on my computer software program, editing program, there is a Ken Burns feature. It's called the Ken Burns feature, which is, you know, to pan around in a very slow and stately way on a still image, right? And it's an effect in the software, and it's an effect that he created, right? Which makes things very compelling. And you know, let me walk back. Yes, it is compelling in many ways. I guess the Vietnam War, his documentary on the Vietnam War, was for me more compelling than the Civil War. I don't quite know why. Perhaps it's because for me the Vietnam War is something closer to home, and I lived it very peripherally and tangentially. I was a boy at the time, but I lived it more. You know what I mean?
No, I think that's fundamentally, it's not a surprise to me. I mean, living memory has a tendency to add a little bit extra juice to the matter, in part because half the energy is, like you say, I remember that happening, and you can, even if, to your point, you were a little kid tangentially paying attention to this, you create an effect of, I remember situating myself in that time. It's the idea of, like, why are people interested in the Kennedy assassination? Well, in part, they can tell you where they were and what they were doing at the time. And that actually adds significant weight to that.
Yeah, exactly.
And especially if you can remember the things that they're talking about. The Civil War obviously is well beyond living memory.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have that ability to kind of jostle you.
Yeah.
on that. To me, what's compelling seeing it now is not necessarily that living memory, because obviously it doesn't exist, but the parallels and sort of imaginative connections that can be made as a result of watching the documentary, particularly when you talk about those early causes of the war and what the sentiment of people around the time was like. I can say, like, when I see, John Brown doing his shit, I'm like, okay, I can think of a few instances, not directly, reproducing what John Brown did, but, that tone and feeling of John Brown, and that notion of being a messianic figure in what you're doing, and that being your motivating factor against your, this other world that you hate or what have you. Yeah, I see parallels of that all the time. So that's, the next best thing I can come up with, just that living memory feeling. And this is tangential. I want to just throw one thing, a little bit of shade to Ken Burn, if you will. He actually didn't come up with that technique. He's attributed to it, but funny enough, one of the movies I do like with Clint Eastwood, The Beguiled, which was remade recently, that movie credit sequence starts out with a more kinetic Ken Burns style. It takes the Brady photographs of the Civil War and pans across them and pivots and all sorts of things, just like Ken Burns did.
Really?
And it's about the Civil War as well. Yeah, he fucking stole it.
Oh, that's interesting. Huh. Okay.
But yeah, I'll throw some shade, meet you halfway.
Okay, no, but going back to the issue of Ken Burns as the Civil War rather as a documentary, I found it very interesting. The episodes I saw were very good. Okay, very interesting. I thought that the pacing was a bit stately. That, how could I put it? It was a bit stately, and there was a sense that they didn't really want to admit a few things. And now I don't know if here I'm afraid I might talk about things that are covered in later episodes, but I know that you've watched it, the entire thing, multiple times, so you'd be able to tell me. You see, there's a sense that Ken Burns sort of like wants to say that the Civil War was not really about slavery, but that slavery was sort of like hoisted onto the Civil War as the justification for it, but that there were really other causes, and that he recognizes that there were other causes, and slavery was just like the post hoc justification for it. Am I reading it wrong?
No, in fact, you're bringing up something very interesting, which is, I would say, he's trying to superimpose a reading of his documentary back onto it. When you see the documentary, there is an open and apparent tension in the documentary by virtue of who's speaking in it. So yes, you have, and I'll get into this in more detail later in the conversation because I think it's important, but when you get Barbara Fields, the Black historian,
right,
talking about this, and you talk about, or you select quotes from Lincoln and the John Brown situation and Frederick Douglass, what have you, you get the strong sense that the narrative is about, well, the blight of slavery can never be forgiven, and all of that other kind of post hoc liberal bullshit.
Right.
But you also have Shelby Foote, who openly and directly says in the documentary that Lincoln superimposed the slavery argument at the end when exhaustion was kicking in, and the thought of him losing election was real. He really explicitly says that. So that tension exists, but retrospectively, and this is what's interesting, and why Ken Burns is a problem for me, he has now said, he's openly denied Shelby Foote's statement. He's like, Shelby was wrong. It really was about slavery. He just had old ways of thinking about things. I said, you fucking asshole, you threw your buddy under the bus here, after he's dead, on top of it.
No, yeah,
but that's bullshit. He's doing his liberal song and dance because he's a member of the Democratic Party now, and he's giving donations to them, and it pisses me off.
Well, yeah, look, the very fact that once the Civil War broke out, it took what, a year and a half, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation was made. That leads me to conclude that it wasn't about slavery. Okay, because if it had been about slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation would have been done, the very next day that hostilities broke out. So bullshit that it was about slavery. Slavery was.
I would phrase it.
I think this is my thinking. Okay, We currently, and the reason I'm interested in the Civil War documentary and the Civil War as a period of history is because I think that you and I both agree that we're going towards a period of civil history currently, right? And what's interesting to me is that, see, the hostilities between the left and the right today, if they were to break out into armed conflict, one decisive issue is abortion rights, for example. And it's a moral issue, it's a political issue, and all the rest of it. It's also an economic issue. Because a lot of women want to have the ability to have an abortion so that they can continue to be employed and not be penalized for having a child, right? Economically penalized. So the abortion issue, if the Civil War broke out today, it would be easy to use the abortion issue as a moral rallying cry on both sides, frankly. But it wouldn't be the cause of the conflict between the left and the right, because we've had this abortion issue for quite some time now. But the Civil War has not broken out over it. It's just one of the issues. And if we were to have a Civil War today, 100 years later, people would say, "Oh yeah, it was all about abortion." But we, living here contemporaneously, we'd know better now, wouldn't we? That's my thinking.
Well, so let me be clear as to my take on the Civil War and slavery. I think, it's simultaneously wrong to say that the war was about slavery, full stop, but it's also wrong to say that slavery had nothing to do with it. I think slavery often is used, if you really look at how the documents are talking about it, how people were talking about it, slavery as a concept is operating like a case of metonymy. So that's a big fancy English language studies word for saying when you use a concept or an object as a representation of a greater whole. An example of this would be
the White House.
The White House, that you're talking about the executive branch of the government. When you're talking about the crown, you're talking about the monarchy in England or wherever as such. Slavery is operating on that as a metonymy example.
I thought it was metonymy. I thought it was. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. Yeah,
neither here nor there. Uh-huh. So slavery often is used as a catch-all for an entire way of life.
Yeah.
Of the South, of which slavery was a key part of it. But when someone says like there's the slave states versus the free states leading up to the Civil War, or you have the peculiar institution of slavery, or when they're talking about it, it's another way you could say this is to say that, well, there's the agrarian way of the American life and the industrial way of the American life, and they were in competition with each other pretty much since Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson started bitching to each other.
Yeah.
When they were in Washington's cabinet.
Yeah.
And because if you really look at their arguments of what they had envisioned for the country and how that plays itself out, it's the Civil War in getting ready to go. You had Alexander Hamilton, whose principal concept of society was centralized, business-oriented, and trade-based, and Jefferson, which was localized, agrarian-based, and if not necessarily federated, at least confederated, even though he wouldn't have used the term.
Yeah.
The idea that there's local, governments, and the local bodies of people are the source of our liberties, and that's the way it goes about. Now, that ultimately branches off into how the North operates and how the South operates.
Yeah.
And slavery is a part of that. And here's the funny joke about slavery. People at the time that the American founding happened thought that, give it a few generations, slavery will go away. It's economically not going to hold fast because it's just too costly to keep these slaves. But the joke of the situation is slavery wound up being profitable in part because of the products of industry. When you had the cotton gin, get invented, which could separate out these little seedlings from the cotton, means you could produce huge quantities of cotton quickly that's consumable. And you are going to create big plantation farms in order to produce a lot of cotton because you can clean through that cotton very quickly. And when you have a big plantation, you need a big, cheap labor force, and slavery fits the bill.
Yeah.
And so that actually drove the slave industry. This is the ironies and the machinations of history that are interesting. But ultimately, this little story that we've said, which is only part of it, is a manifestation of what I just said, which is it's not just slavery, full stop. That is stupid, fundamentally. That's, reducing everything to one concept, which is not the case. But at the same time, I would say you can't exclude it either.
Yeah, you can't exclude it, but you can't say that it was really the cause of it. One of the things I was struck by, incidentally, let's talk about really quickly about the actual prosecution of the war. I was struck by the incompetence of the North. That's something that I had really not thought to myself. I studied all this history, back in college, right? And I just studied it and got through it, and just to get the credit, right? Because I was interested in other kind of history, really, and I had to do like an American history credit in order to get my major. And Civil War, sure, in high school, and well, actually, I did high school in Chile, but in elementary school, yeah, I'd learned the basics of it. But reading it now, because before watching the documentary, I brushed up a little bit on my Civil War history so I wouldn't be lost in the documentary at any point, and I'd know what's what, and more importantly, be able to spot Ken Burns' biases or his approach that I disagreed with or what have you. And what I found interesting was that looking at it now, the incredible incompetence of the North, of Lincoln and how he prosecuted the war. Because now Doris Kearns Goodwin does, the Cabinet of Enemies. What did she call that book of hers?
Group of Rivals or something.
Cabinet of Rivals, something like that, yeah. And sort of like, says, oh, they were so wonderful and that clash, created great results. They were fucking incompetent, leaderless, rudderless. Lincoln was a weak president, it was weird because he was simultaneously a weakling insofar as the prosecution of the war and a tyrant. I can understand John Wilkes Booth, and I'm really surprised by me saying that. But watching this documentary and reading into the history a little bit more, I'm like really surprised that because the guy was really grabbing for power and trying to centralize the state. And at the same time, he was prosecuting the war in such a weak way with such clearly incompetent people. And bullshit this stuff that, he didn't have anybody else to replace McClellan with, for instance. McClellan was just complete incompetent. He was a coward. He loved having, the pretty army, but he didn't have the balls to take that army and take it to battle, because that's the whole point of an army. You don't create an army just to have it there on parade. But that's what McClellan apparently wanted, and he could never have enough soldiers because the guy was a coward because he was afraid of losing. He was afraid of taking risks, right? So my thinking is that the North didn't win the war. It was the South that lost it, okay? Because the North was just incompetent. During half the war, I was really shocked, okay? And that's the thing that really, I don't know about you. What did you think?
Well, the reasons for the incompetency in the North partly is what you kind of dismissed. There was a dearth of the good officers, because those who were in charge of the army before even the breakout, let alone like the idea that a lot of the great officers went south. That's just objectively true. They did. The head of the army, Winfield Scott, was so fat he couldn't ride on his horse. That was the absolute state of that Northern Army, and it was not really equipped to handle full-scale war, nor, frankly, to some degree, were the South. The South, was frankly operating on piss and vinegar, and for a long time. But the North had competent leaders. It was a struggle to find them because they were such, in many ways, fuck-ups. Like Grant was a fucking drinker and a man who failed at pretty much everything in his life outside of being in a war situation. The other fellow, Sherman, was kind of freaky, as a person. People just felt very uncomfortable with him, so they just didn't give him a command until later on. That was part of the issue. And when you're in a situation like that logistically, even if Lincoln wanted to personally direct the army, the leadership just isn't prepared to deal with it. There were literal fuck up guys running the army in the North. Like, my favorite is General Burnside, who fucked up like 2 or 3 times in a big way. My favorite being near the end of the war, when they have the North basically tunneled under the Confederate lines, put explosives under them, blew it up, created this massive crater. And Burnside's solution was to charge into the crater to get to the South, and his men got trapped in the hole, and the Southerners just fucking picked them all off.
Yeah.
Or a good portion of them. And then he basically said at the end of the war, he says, "I do believe I probably got in over my head," or something to that effect.
Oh,
I mean,
God.
and there were a lot of guys like that in the North.
Yeah.
Which just goes to show you that, to a certain extent, your ability to really be, as it were, top-down, heavy-handed leader still is fundamentally predicated on the logistics of, your underlings being able to execute on your vision. Because Lincoln was a tyrant in the things that he could control.
Yeah.
Namely, the managing of the local militias, the ability to say fuck off with habeas corpus, the ability to fuck with the Supreme Court and just ignore it if he so chose. I mean,
Which he did.
That was in his power to do, and he did that. But he just couldn't control the army because there was nobody, effectively controlling the army to begin with. It took him a long fucking time for those competent guys to make themselves known.
Yeah, and Lincoln is just this hero, and he wasn't a hero. I understand that the national myth requires that we have him be heroic, but the fact of the matter is, he was far from heroic. He was a tyrant, and I can understand John Wilkes Booth. I mean, I'm really surprised that's my ultimate conclusion, okay? Because I hadn't really thought of it in those such stark terms until this very conversation that we're having. But he really was a tyrant. He really was a guy who was willing to destroy the village in order to save it, He destroyed all of the principles of the Republic in order to, quote-unquote, save it. And what did he create? Well, he created an empire. He was the first of the imperial presidents. Really, not Andrew Jackson. It was Lincoln. I'm sorry.
Yes. So this is why the Civil War to me is an extremely interesting topic, and why I think it's relevant to what our situation. That was an existential war, like you couldn't, argue against. It's just at its DNA level. It's about what the United States is and should be. Part of the reason that it still has that juice is that people get agitated depending on your take on the Civil War. Just say anything about the Civil War not being the primary cause of the war, and see what the local black liberal community has to say.
Yeah. The blacks will have a hissy fit. Yeah,
exactly. And not every war does this. I mean, like, nobody has a fucking care in the world as to your opinion per se on World War I, because there was no existential issue as a cause of the war. I mean, there was an existential output of the war. Namely, everybody died. But the war in and of itself, no, you can have whatever the fuck opinion you want. Same thing with the Mexican-American War to a certain extent, the Crimean War. Pick your war. They just fundamentally were not about existential issues. They were about, territory, political expansion, money, whatever you want to cause. These kind of wars, like World War II and the Civil War, are loaded with existential issues, which is why you can't have certain interpretations of them. And I think that's why this one is interesting, and why Lincoln is, I think I said it before when we were talking about he's really a villain, is that Lincoln was a conduit of this existential rewriting of the country, in many ways for ill, I would say.
Yes.
And it's funny when he's in the first episode of the Ken Burns documentary, he says, he has a quote from Lincoln from the 1830s, which is incredibly well written, and that is something I acknowledge about Lincoln. Whether you think he did good or ill, the man was a
great writer,
gifted writer.
Yeah,
one of the best I've ever seen. Probably it was one of the smartest men to be president, if that's a moniker of potentially, his writing, his ability to kind of communicate that. But he said in the 1830s, like, look, no, and I'm this is paraphrasing, unfortunately, so just bear with me. This country cannot fall or be destroyed from the outside. No European tyrant could invade the country and drink from the Ohio River.
Yeah.
But if this country were to die, it will be through suicide, through its own hands, through the own destruction of the liberty it holds dear. And I'm shocked to read it, because arguably, when you look at the prosecution of the war and what the country became afterwards, you could argue that rather than being the guy who stopped the suicide, he was the architect of the suicide. It just died in a way you couldn't easily recognize.
Yeah, by the way,
the movement.
I'm saying, go ahead. No, I killed your flow. Go ahead. You were saying?
Oh no, I was wrapping it up. Like, I think he was an agent of that suicide.
Yes,
absolutely do.
yes, he was. By the way, the quote is America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves, which is a great line. Yeah. Because we destroy ourselves, if we falter and lose our freedoms. Yeah. It's an amazing line. But look, he was a great writer, and you and I, adore great writers. But this guy, no. Uh, I wonder what would have happened if the secession had happened, if the states would have recoalesced into a federated republic.
Oh, you mean if let's say the South, they just let the South go, like
Yeah,
what would have happened?
or if it had lost or whatever. If Gettysburg had been a decisive loss for the North, what would have happened?
So and even the interpretation of what would happen, I feel, is going to be predicated on, like I said, the moral issues and the existential issues going through. I think some people would try to argue that, oh, it would have been little pearl like Latin America of little countries that the Europeans would have made mincemeat of by having one against the other. I honestly think probably not. I think you would have just simply have seen two very intimately related countries operate, with near each other. They would have had border disputes, but it wouldn't have. It would have been like a, two, countries with shared blood, operating near each other. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if they recoalesced at some point under different kinds of rules. Not necessarily truly, top down, but some sort of compromise could have easily happened. I mean, that was one of the great Shelby Foote lines of the documentary, was that the genius for our country is not that we're steadfast and resolute and recalcitrant. It's that we compromise
Yeah,
and we negotiate.
yeah.
And I think you would have seen probably negotiated, for lack of a better term, a peace between the two groups.
Yeah, well, my thinking is that it would have been like the relationship between the United States and Canada, for instance. I mean, when was the last U.S. Canadian war, for crying out loud? The beginning of the 19th century at some point? Um, uh, 58 or fight? What was the line? I forget the slogan,
50,
right?
54-40 or fight, which was the latitudinal
Yeah,
divide.
yeah.
And that was before the Civil War.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that was the last time that there were like real issues with Canada, right? So it would have been reasonable to suspect that the United States, what we consider the continental United States, could have broken up into potentially three countries: uh, uh, the Texas, California, the North, and the South. I mean, Sam Houston's dream of an independent Republic of Texas that would have stretched easily to California, covered that Southwest desert and all the way to California. That makes sense geopolitically. It makes sense with the Rio Grande as the dividing line between the California and Mexico. Excuse me, of the Republic of Cali, Texas, if you will, and Mexico, and something along those lines of like three or perhaps even four big Anglo republics in the North American continent. I'm including Canada, by the way. Canada is the big wasteland of the North that nobody really wants to go there, and then the industrial Northeast kind of thing, sort of like Pennsylvania and New England, and Pennsylvania, New York, New England, and and potentially, stretching all the way across the Ohio Valley and all the way to Chicago. Well, yeah, Chicago, Illinois, all that. Like that northern plain kind of thing, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
South, the traditional South, and then like Texas, California, kind of something like that, you know? That makes sense geopolitically. I mean, considering the natural boundaries between them, right? And like that Texas, California, perhaps crawling up the coast all the way to Washington, what is now Washington State, sort of like a J shape, Republic of Texas kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Rockies would have been the natural barrier, and the north stretching all the way from the Atlantic all the way to Montana, which again is like the Montana, Wyoming, which is like the natural boundary there, and the south stretching, from the Atlantic all the way to Oklahoma, kind of thing. Does this make sense geopolitically?
In theory, yes. There always would have been, conflicts over resources, what have you. But here's the thing that, as in considering the history, watching the documentary, what have you, I realized, and I guess I've suspected this for a while, but I'm going to articulate it first now, is that the Civil War was, in many ways, an imperialistic war, and I
Yeah.
would frame it this way: it was a war predicated in part on the North deciding to construct the nation. First off, to construct a nation, which in and of itself was controversial at the time.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't see themselves as a united nation in that regard. But the other element of it was to say, look, our business interest, are going to dominate the country going forward. And funny enough that our abolitionists probably really believe in abolition, but but the byproduct of that would be your agrarian way of life. The tariffs that benefit you will go. The tariffs that benefit us will stay. We will, dominate you, and that was part of the cause in the Civil War. When you look at the compromises going in place, it wasn't entirely compromises around like who is and is not a slave. It was compromises about which states would be basically categorized as northern states and which states would be categorized as southern states.
Yeah.
And they became free and slave states. But that was an attempt to maintain the balance of power in the Senate.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you have more non-slave states than southern states or slave states, that means that when votes come up and people are voting like their people are, like, all politics is some set local, and their identity politics, whether they would have said it at the time or not, it was a kind of identity politics. Your position on the peculiar institution was a proxy for a lot of other things.
Mm-hmm.
That was the deal was to avoid this war. People would have said, look, no, your side can't dictate to my side what our life should be, and vice versa. We have to deal with that. That broke down, and Lincoln's election was a manifestation of that. It's like, no, fuck you. We in the North have more weight, money, and sway than you, and we're going to decide things. And that was the fundamental issue. So yes, slavery is a part of it, but people are trying very hard to keep their way of life, whether you like it or not. That's what people wanted to do, and that is the parallel I see today. There is a fight about a way of life here.
Yes.
That's going on.
Yes. Yeah. And I wonder if Trump is like the James Buchanan figure. Okay. The predecessor to the president who breaks the balance, because I don't think that he's like the president that's breaking the balance now. Because what I'm saying right now, it just sounds like off the wall, but what I'm basically saying is that it seems that we're my thinking, and I think, Benway, yours is too, is that we're edging towards a civil war. And we're edging towards it because there are political divides. Now, do keep in mind, the people in the United States pre-1861 did not imagine that there would be a civil war per se. It was just like a political fight. I mean, like in the 1830s, for example, it was just political fighting going on over political sides and how you wanted the country to go, what direction you wanted it to be in, to be going in, right? They weren't thinking to themselves, we're 20 odd years away from civil war. No, they were thinking that I want my policies to win out over the policies of that guy on the opposite side of the aisle, right? That's what was going on. That's always the case in every civil war. I mean, it's politics that just becomes too polarized and eventually breaks out into warfare, internecine warfare, right? Now, my thinking is that today we're sort of like edging towards that. And I'm wondering who the figure is going to be. You mentioned that Lincoln was the tipping point figure who tipped it over into open civil war. I wonder who that will be in our time. My thinking is that if the Democrats win, they'll have somebody who's like a full-on SJW, and that will be the tipping point figure. That's...
Yes, I think it would fundamentally be that. I think and I could think of it this way, part of the reason the South, who, by the way, wouldn't even let Lincoln on the fucking ballot in the South, that's how much they despise this man. I think part of the reason, and they probably even read too much aggression into Lincoln, but they suspected that Lincoln would, to your point, end the balance of power. He clearly didn't like slavery. He wasn't going to abolish it outright, but he certainly was going to keep it from, expanding, and certainly wasn't about to compromise in the way that his predecessors in the 1850s, the Great Compromise of 1850, were willing and prepared to do.
Yeah.
So I think, it probably would be an SJW, and I think it would be around a policy of either things like reparations or something quota based, or the idea that, there's an inherent problem with white people that we're going to punish, and they're going to run on that.
Yeah.
I think the challenge as always is never rule out a self-loathing white population to mitigate against the obvious self-preservation element that we should have in the response of that. Namely, if you're white and someone says white people are going to pay, you say, fuck you. That's the typical response when someone comes at you with violence, which is what a policy like that would be. It would be an act of violence.
Yeah.
I think, if so, setting aside the white the white guilt and that anti-mitigating, or that mitigating factor to what I'm about to say, if that were to happen, yes, there would be open revolt, because white people would probably not stand for that for obvious reasons. Namely, like I said, they would defend themselves. I think that would be the equivalent of it. And what's odd about it, though, and this is where things get complicated, is that in some sense I can see it on a state-by-state basis. Like, there are some red states that are truly red, but I think it's like house to house, block to block kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because it's not that so perfectly distributed between the red and the blue, like the North and the South would be. So that's where things get hairy.
I think it is actually geographically based. It's the coastal elites versus flyover country.
Could be.
I mean, because there's a clear divide. What?
Even in the flyover country, I would say it would be the urban versus the rural, ultimately, because if you look at the vote in the 2016 election, it's Hillary got the 56 counties or whatever they were. Those were the urban centers. Mm-hmm. And that would be where the support ultimately comes from one side versus the other. Mm-hmm. And in those urban centers, like, I know there are Trump supporters in the Chicagoland area. They have to hide it because people get beat.
Yeah, they're literally getting beaten up. You heard about that case about that Marine that got beat up the other day?
Oh, I did not hear about this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the details, so I'm not going to get into it. But apparently, some Marine was walking around with some, Make America Great Again gear or whatever, and he got assaulted. And yeah, it's. I don't know the details, so I don't want to get into it. But we're heading in that direction. I mean, we're seeing enough of it all over the goddamn place, right? That people, because it's really interesting. The MAGA stuff, the Make America Great Again stuff. It's really, on its face, what the hell are you supposed to say to that? How are you supposed to say that that's evil? It's like as milquetoast as, every mother is wonderful and apple pie is the best pie. I mean, it's just trivial, right?
Exactly. It's motherhood. It's meant to be motherhood and apple pie.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. But the thing is, see, it has become symbolic, not just of Trump, but a way of it's anti-left. And it's the left that's having this meltdown because they are going fucking insane. That's the thing. From my point of view, see, on our side, on the right-wing side, we have an opioid crisis. That's our crisis. The right, the poor right, the people who are disenfranchised, the people who are just not making it, who are struggling, they can't pay their bills, they're turning to drugs. But on the left, it seems that it's not that they're turning to drugs, they're turning to communism, socialism. They're turning to extreme political ideology and extreme political hysteria. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, and that's what's interesting on our existential crisis. I do think there is a debate between at least two ways of lives going on here, but there's also a fundamental disillusionment. What was the great thing that people attributed to Nietzsche, or at least Nietzsche said about the genealogy of morals? It's like, when God died, here's what's going to happen. The 20th century will be the century of the greatest of wars and conflict as a result of no longer having this moral guiding principle going forward. And after that, the 21st century will be even more terrifying, because that'll be the century when you will see what happens when all moral underpinnings of the society no longer are relevant and people are struggling to deal with them.
He was that prescient?
And I have a feeling that Yeah, apparently it was that prescient.
I'd love to see that
Or at least that's an interpretation of it. Like I may be, to be
Gilding the
fair,
Lily.
could be overreading it.
Okay.
But needless to say, that's attributed to Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you're seeing here and now, above and beyond the Civil War, I'm willing to bet some elements of the South had that existential crisis, like because it was poor. I mean, say what you will about the agricultural business, the big planters. Like, if you're a little sharecropper guy, you're a fucking poor guy, and
Yeah.
life isn't very great. But you throw it in our context, I think the opioid crisis absolutely is. That's a result of someone who doesn't have hope trying to deal with the situation.
Yeah.
And also the move to communism, and is, I think, in a weird way, also a manifestation of that. It's like I have no hope but to the system that promises utopia.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's funny how, like, I think it was Faith Goldie who posted this report. It was a few weeks ago. I forgot what it was, but essentially it was like a poll that said majority of young people are either in favor of far right wing neo-Nazi parties or far left wing socialist parties, and very few are centrist. And my response to that was, you can say what you will about the rise and trend of one versus the other, but there's absolutely one clear sign in these results to me, which is the majority of the young would accept anything other than what they're living in now.
Yes, and that's catastrophic because when the youth are no longer, especially the capable youth, they are no longer willing to follow in the footsteps of their elders and join the wider society and the then you're in trouble. Then that society is in real trouble. Look, every society is based on the young. The young are the future. It sounds so cliche and all the rest of it, but it's fucking true. Okay, the people who are young today, who are teenagers in their early 20s today, in 30 years, they're going to be running the show, right? And 30 years gets behind you awfully fast. Now, you have to make sure that those young people today buy into your society. It doesn't really matter what society that is. Okay, forget about that. I'm talking about just on an existential level, the society has to convince the young people that it is working, that it is a workable society. And it seems clear to me by that polling data that if everybody wants to be either a socialist or a neo-Nazi, then they don't believe in the shit that's going on now. They don't believe in the brand that the current leadership, the current elites are selling. And the current elites are unwilling to change. And I think that that's the problem. And notice something interesting, that the elites are, they're not the baby boomers, right? But they're sort of like the ones who are following the baby boomers. A lot of them are Gen Xers, right? And they are not well, actually, that's not true. The people who are dominating things, they really are baby boomers. Trump, Clinton, and both Clintons, right? Yeah, Obama was not technically a baby boomer, but he was ruled by baby boomers. He did what baby boomers told him to do. He was not his own man. It's depressing.
This may be a little off topic, but I actually think it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I have this. Tell me if I'm wrong, because you're of the Generation X cohort. I have this very odd feeling that Gen X, when it comes to politics, we've talked about for a long time that the baby boomer rule on politics, at least from Bill to currently, is very much what it is. I have this strong feeling like Gen X is like, just based on their mentality and how they currently think, they're like, we're checking out on this one. I mean, yeah, you may be the ass warmers in the seats holding power, but it's like, it's going to be my crowd that actually has some fucking conviction. I'm not saying it's good conviction. I'm just saying it's something. Whereas, like, I felt like Gen X is like, we're going to just kind of mentally check out to a certain extent.
Yes,
I would agree. A real leadership role.
I would agree, except the SJWs. The hardcore leftists, I mean, they're there in positions of power. I can name you, a professor at NYU who is like a key figure, from my generation in college, and she's just SJW to the core. She's a nasty piece of work. She was a nasty piece of work in college, and out of curiosity, I checked up on her now, and she's equally nasty piece of work. A typical feminist SJW, but she's dressed up like corporate and conservative and sensible. And, those are the people who are in positions of power, who have been reaching for power. Okay, but the more normal ones, certainly the right-wing ones, They checked out of politics. They went into private business. They saw no incentive to going into politics. Okay, and they went out and made as much money as possible. I mean, it's certainly my case. My goal was to just make money. Fuck politics. Okay, why? Why would I bother? Okay, the only ones who decided to go into politics were the leftists. Either go into politics directly or go into politics in influential positions where they could really change things and change people, change generational attitudes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the other parallel. It's not necessarily the Civil War per se; it's the aftermath. I'm particularly, and this is why the conflict is, if it comes, is going to be not just scary how it gets fought, but what happens afterwards. I think there are members on the left who fundamentally are the very much mental equivalents of the radical Republicans. So this is the irony of John Wilkes Booth. Even though I understand him, it remains to be seen whether or not Lincoln would have had a heavy hand in Reconstruction afterwards. By all accounts of his writing on the matter and his discussions, Lincoln seemed to would have been softer on the South. But after he died, and obviously was killed, the radical Republican leadership in Congress, decided to be very draconian with the South. We're going to dictate a new order in the South. We're going to have people. This is where you have the concept of the carpetbagger coming in. The Northerners coming in, rewriting things. We're going to say, okay, the blacks in these areas now have the right to vote. And by the way, you got your first black congressmen and senators at this point in time. And as a result of that, there was an extraordinary imposed. It was an occupying force. I mean, that's literally what it was. And that rewriting of the DNA, I mean, ultimately it sort of failed because the radical Republicans ultimately died out in Congress. But they had a very strong 10 years there. I mean, remember, these are the people who nearly impeached. Actually, they did impeach Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president and successor, because he wasn't harsh enough. As far as they're concerned. And I think my generation, and more broadly, or more specifically, I should say, if you want to call it the SJW crowd, at least with the left-wing crowd, really is that temperament. And I think that if a conflict does ensue and our side loses, be prepared for the radical Republicans to come back, and they will come back in full force, and they will. And what's worse in this case, rather than make you better people, I have a strong feeling that these guys are operating more like the communists of old and would rather just end you one way or another.
Look, my thinking is very clear on this point, and I'll say it publicly. I don't have a problem with it. The 2020 nominee for the Democratic Party is probably going to be Kamala Harris. She's black and she's a woman, and she's going to run and she's going to lose. And Kirsten Gillibrand is not going to run in 2020 because she's up for re-election in the Senate. And Trump is going to win in 2024. Kirsten Gillibrand will become president, and she is a hardcore SJW. She is an evil person. And you think that I'm exaggerating, all the rest of it, you wait. She is an evil person, and she will do some horrifying things. I have no doubt in my mind that she will be like. Here's the thing that's going on with this hysteria insofar as Trump is concerned. How ICE is basically running concentration camps and like eating up minority babies in the morning, and tossing their bones out every night. That kind of hysteria, right? It's totally untrue. It's totally ridiculous. But it gives the moral justification for the left to do exactly what they are describing in their hysteria when they have the levers of power. Okay? It's like priming the ground so that actually will happen. As insane as that may sound. But, think about it, because I think in a weird way, it's projection. They want to do this. They want to imprison everybody who disagrees with them. It's a kind of insanity that they are experiencing collectively. They are going crazy,
Oh, I know. That's the thing. And I've said that publicly as well, that, hey, look, I know that the left wing projects all the time. Especially, all you had to do was see their response to the 2016 election. Remember when they thought they were going to win and they said, Trump's being a baby for suggesting the election might be rigged. The election could never be rigged. He just has to accept the results. Day after election, fuck you, I don't accept the results of the election.
It was rigged.
It was rigged. All that. So they are projecting. And so when they say, like, I think Trump's going to suspend the election, if it looks like he won't win, I know damn well that what they're really saying is, I would suspend the election if I could.
Yeah. And they're becoming more and more radicalized. Now, my thinking is that the reason they're able, that this kind of crazy talk is gaining traction is because so many people in what used to be the middle class are lower class. They are living paycheck to paycheck. They are maxed out on their credit cards. They're living lives of quiet desperation. Okay. And I think that that's the problem that we're experiencing. And I'm using the phrase about the Brits, but in this case of quiet desperation, I'm not talking about existential or psychological desperation. I'm talking about an actual monetary, financial desperation. I think that that's the problem. And that's why you're seeing on our side of the fence, the radicalization. People are openly talking about fascism, for crying out loud, and they're getting huge audiences. Okay, there's a reason for that. Like Faith Goldie's, thing, the survey that she posted, right? People don't see the middle as providing the solutions. People don't see the middle, the consensus, moderate politics as providing a good life for people. And so they're naturally gravitating to their extremes. And all this horseshoe theory bullshit of the liberalists and whatever. Oh, come on, blow me, for crying out loud. What's going on is this flat out political polarization, and people are going to wind up killing each other.
Oh, yeah, that's my favorite. I love the horseshoe theory when they turn around and say, well, you guys, basically, when you disagree with us, it's the same kind of thing. So it's clearly we're right and you're all the same. Oh, God. And here. And my response is, look, I phrase it this way. You're so obviously fucked up that people who fundamentally don't agree with each other on a damn thing still can find it in their hearts to realize, yeah, you're a fucking idiot. That's how much of an idiot you are.
Yeah, the left and the right find the liberalisms, like fucking buffoons, for crying out loud. It's pretty fucking funny. What's amusing to me also is that the YouTube community, our environment, is in a weird way, a political microcosm of what's going on in the Western democracies. The liberalists are getting mocked and just squashed. And what's interesting is that they are stagnating, in terms of views and such. So, I think that, how could I put it? Okay, we've strayed quite some distance from the original topic, which was the U.S. Civil War.
Well, here's something I will bring it back and tie the two together. So again, like I said, I think the parallels to the causation seem there. I think the parallels to what could happen afterwards seem there. What we haven't talked about is the parallels of right when it gets going. And there's been some rhetoric on our side that kind of chills me to the bone. Not because I think that, I think they're saying something evil or dangerous. No, it's not that. It's that I've heard this sentiment before, and I'll phrase it this way. In the beginning of the Civil War, if you were to talk to the Southern volunteers, the Northern volunteers, the Northern leadership, the Southern leadership, they would have all said the same thing. This is going to be a cakewalk for our side. We are so superior in these skills or that skills or this, weaponry or that weaponry. It's going to be over in a week. Mark my words. We're just too fucking strong. Literally, the first battle of the Civil War, the Bull Run or Manassas, depending on which perspective you had. People were picnicking to see it. And it became a fucking disaster because it was an actual fucking bloody fight.
Yeah.
You hear this on our side. I see it in our comments on our videos. When people say, our side has all the weapons. You are repeating what was exactly said. If you're repeating it, that means it can fuck up exactly the same way.
Exactly.
Don't overestimate your capabilities. And don't underestimate the opposition.
Yeah,
you brought this up before. The communist, if let's say there are communists involved here, communists when they're dedicated, they can train to shoot. Communists can shoot in South America. Communists can shoot in Eastern Europe. Mark my words, they know how to.
Yeah,
and independent of that, like even the apparatuses of the government, if the apparatuses of the government think you're a problem as a right winger because you are fundamentally challenging the status quo, they'll say, "Army, go get these motherfuckers."
Yeah, exactly.
And you could win against that. But it's going to be like a Vietnam, and a lot of you are going to die. More of you will die than they will.
Yeah, well, there's something really interesting. See, we presuppose that the people who have the guns are on our side. Remember that Army officer, or West Point cadet rather, Spencer Rapone, who
Yeah.
he graduated and flashed a T-shirt he had underneath of the communist symbol. I mean, the fucking moron, right? But well, who does that? A true believer. Okay, the guy really is a commie. Okay, he really believes this shit. Because somebody casual who thinks it's a goof or a lark would probably actually not do it. Okay, somebody who wears a Che Guevara T-shirt, ironically, would never flash it. In that situation, the only person who would flash it is a dyed-in-the-wool commie. What, you think that he's the only commie in the army? The only commie who's got some weapons training? All you'd need is, say, half a dozen special forces or SEALs or whatever, who are communists who could train a battalion of Antifa to use weapons properly. That's what they do. That's what special forces are all about. They're actually not supposed to be a fighting force. They're supposed to be a stiffening force. You're supposed to insert them into a larger group and have them train and prepare a larger group so they can carry out guerrilla fighting. That's the point of special forces. You need just half a dozen of those guys, and you can get an army within 6 months of 1,000 Antifa who are trained, who know what to do, who would be ready for guerrilla warfare and be very effective, a very effective fighting force. So this kind of we'd win. Yeah, that's stupid. That drives me a little bit nuts,
It does me too, which is why I brought it up. And the only thing you have to do to know that there are hard left-wingers in the army. Remember what happened after Vietnam. Remember, the disillusioned soldiers who arguably went left, and this fucking war and all the shit. People, did freak out as a result of that war because it was fucking psychologically brutal. After Afghanistan and Iraq as well, I don't know if you remember, Haskell Wexler, the famous cinematographer, he directed Medium Cool.
Mm-hmm.
He did a documentary around the NATO protests in Chicago.
Really?
And a number of the people there, I saw the documentary. It's horrific left-wing bullshit, but it's a real sentiment. People were there. They actually did that stuff. The lot of the left-wing extremists there were a number of soldiers there who said, I think I fucked up by doing these things for my country. You create left-wing thinkers as a result of bad war decisions.
Yeah.
It happens.
It happens all the time.
There will be, mark my words, there will be hardcore left-wingers disillusioned from the army for whatever reason, who would willingly fight for, or to your point, train up people to fight that war if they really believed it. And I guarantee you some of them believe it.
Yeah, because there's something else too, that the left has always been better at motivating its people. It's always been better at keeping the motivation up. Right wing, because left-wingers, I think that what happens is that with socialism, with communism, there is a direct feeling, a direct correlation that what I am doing is creating a society that is better. Whereas on the right wing, it's basically saying, I'm creating a society that's free. And that's very different, okay? You're just fighting for a society that's free as opposed to fighting a society where I will directly make it better. The latter is a far more convincing argument. That's why the left, we were talking about Vietnam War, right? The North Vietnamese, the communists, they could get the people, they could recruit them, and they would go and they would fight, and they would carry their baskets of crap across some blown out bridge and repair it, and they would do everything necessary to win. And the right, with all the material that the Americans supplied, they just sort of frittered it away and just let it all die.
As I said before, and I hope people don't misinterpret what I'm saying. A positive vision is always easier to sell than a negative vision.
Yeah.
By that, I don't mean positive and happy versus sad, and even though sometimes that is part of the left versus right. What I mean is positive in the sense that you have a forward-looking, I'm going to do these new things, versus negative, which is I'm going to stop, we're not going to do these things, or I'm going to stop X, Y, and Z from happening. Sometimes you can get those negative messages to work. More often than not, no, because it's more abstract thinking. It doesn't really, 40 acres and a mule, bring it back to the Civil War. Say, I'm going to give every black freed slave 40 acres and a mule. You get a bit behind it. You know exactly what that is. To say, if you're in the South, it's we're going to preserve the integrity of X, Y, or Z. Harder to sell.
Yeah.
for
It's
lack of
impossible
better.
to sell.
It's just the nature. It's the nature of the business. I mean, sorry to call it a business, but sometimes it feels like.
Yeah, and so I'm like very concerned because the Civil War, I'm really the U.S. Civil War of 1861 to 1865. In and of itself, I find it. I'm mildly interested in it, but first of all, you have to keep in mind that as somebody an American of Chilean descent, and both of my parents are Chilean, and we all went back to Chile. I am marginally interested in American history because it didn't really affect me or affect my forefathers. I'm interested, though, on several fronts, on the social causes of it that led to it. The on the one hand, on the other, the post hoc rationalization that it was a moral fight over slavery. On the third hand, if you will, on the military aspects of it, that this was the first time where you had mechanized war, or something approaching mechanized war, that you would really see later on in both World War I and World War II. When I talk about mechanized war, I'm talking like machine weaponry, like machine guns. The Gatling
gun, the ironclad ship.
Yeah, exactly.
The heavy artillery.
Yeah,
all of this shit. Yeah,
yeah. The use of industry turned to war. That is really fascinating. The second issue that I find fascinating is the sheer bloodthirstiness of the battles. When we talk about great battles of the past in history, a few hundred people died. It wasn't that big of a deal. Like Agincourt. I'm looking it up now. It wasn't that many people who died in the battle. I'm looking it up now as we're looking. Yeah, it was okay. It was on the side of the French. It was estimates go from 1,500 people to 11,000 people killed. Okay. Let's just split the difference and say it was 6,000 killed, just for the sake of argument. That's a lot of people, right? The other side, the British side, it was between 112 people and 600 killed. Nobody's quite sure, so let's again split the difference and say it was 300, okay? So altogether, let's just say it was 6,500 people killed, right? Just for the sake of argument.
You can get that many people killed in a first 5 minutes of a battle of the Civil War.
Exactly. And Agincourt was a major battle. It decided the war, and basically it was because of this battle, that the Brits conquered France, for crying out loud, right? It was a major deal, and the Civil War dwarfed those numbers. I mean, the battles before this. I mean, how can I put this? I want to tie this into the following. Number one, I think that these catastrophic losses influence the country demographically in ways that could never be recovered from. And the great immigrations of the late 19th century, specifically of Poles, Italians, Jews, Irish, those great waves of immigrants, Ukrainians, Norwegians, Swedes, what have you, they were necessary because of the demographic losses caused by the Civil War. 2% of the men died. 2% of all men in America died during the Civil War. That is catastrophic. That is, because of course they were young. They were young who would have had families,
And you have to look at it from the cohorts. Yes, 2% of the overall male population, but what was the percentage of men age 15 through 35?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm willing to bet it's a lot more than 2%.
Oh, yeah, much higher by definition, because the people killed were of that demographic for the vast majority of the cases, right? And all those people would have gotten married. And this was an age when there were relatively few women who had children out of wedlock. Okay. Apart from the social stigma, it was just the practical financial reality of not being able to support a child if you didn't have a man around. Okay. And so those women, they were spinsters. They never married, never had children, and the demographic effects of that, would have been catastrophic over the ensuing decades. And so it required these waves of European immigrants during the late 19th century. Had they not happened, the United States would not have the population it is today. And you have to look at the United States today. It is dominated by people whose last names are of immigrants of that 19th century wave. 19th century wave that was necessitated by the Civil War. And this ties into Unwin. JD Unwin, that I always talk about him in Sex and Culture and how that book influenced me, and how he says that basically you see the demographic catastrophes affect a society not necessarily immediately, but often as not, and for some odd reason, 100 years later. And I tend to think that in the 60s, it's when the old Anglo America died. And think about it. It was at that period of time during the 60s that the minority and immigrant populations started taking over. And the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cohorts just shuffled off the stage of America. I mean, apart from the Bush family, who are just, they're gone, really. I mean, now that Jeb is lost, the WASPs don't run shit now. Look at the political leadership. Look at the last names of the political leadership. Pelosi, Ted Cruz, go down the list. They're all immigrants. Right. You know what I'm saying? Immigrants, 19th century immigrants. Yep. The WASPs, the original Americans, okay, original European Americans, if you want to call them that, they got wiped out. And I think they got wiped out in the 60s as a result of the Civil War. You see what I'm saying? Does this make sense to you? And well, we're seeing it again in Europe because of the First World War. The catastrophe of the First World War happened 1914, 1918. 100 years later, what's happening now? This, the soy Europeans, the cuck Europeans, right? And being invaded by the Muslims. There's a causal link there. Oh, well, I'm sorry, I'm babbling, but
No. I think you're right. I think 60s was probably around the time that, the WASPs were still around, but they no longer could control all the reins of power. It was over.
Yeah.
And funny, now you're actually seeing that first, like you said, that first 19th, early 20th century round of immigrants also are starting to lose. They can't hold all the reins anymore. So, they're starting to feel it too. So, irony of ironies, I suppose.
No. I see it different. I see that cohort firmly holding it. But what we're experiencing now, this civil war that we're experiencing, I think it's just, I'm very Marxist in that regard of viewing economics über alles, insofar as motivation is concerned. Because if you can't feed your family, then you get desperate. And I think that's the problem that we're experiencing. That what's the figure now, that 50% of the population could not get $1,000 for an emergency? They simply could not cobble together $1,000 for an emergency in the United States. That's kind of shocking if you think about it, because $1,000 is not a lot of money, and if you can't put that kind of money together quickly, then what's it say about you? You know what I mean?
Well, like I said, when you and I say it's not a lot of money, it's for, like you said, for 50% of the country, it is a lot of money.
Yeah,
and that's a scary thing.
That is a very scary thing. Okay, I mean, it's okay. I'm sorry. I'm sort of like, I guess I'm getting a little bit desperate because I feel that we are nearing a point of no return, and I don't quite see how the American society can go back, step away from the precipice. Because, watching this documentary, the Ken Burns documentary, the parallels pre-Civil War to what we're experiencing today just seemed incredible to me. It wasn't like a specific political issue. It was just like a vibe. You know what I mean?
It was the zeitgeist, absolutely. Because you can ask yourself, if you will, at what was the last point at which anything could have resolved. And I honestly think that the last time any kind of compromise could have been made was the time that a compromise was made, the Great Compromise of 1850, which basically ensured that the even balance between free states and slave states. After that, you could see it in the way people talked about this matter, the way they acted to each other, the way they responded to acts of violence of one side against the other. There was no reconciliation to be had. There fundamentally were two different worldviews that would not coalesce.
Exactly.
And what I see right now is two worldviews that will not coalesce. You think there's going to be the equivalent of the Great Compromise of 1850, happening now between the Trump world, or shall we say red state America, and the blue state America? No fucking way is it going to happen. And that means that we are in that pre-Civil War state. Buckle up, buckaroo.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, preach it, because like I feel that we're getting to that point of polarization, and what's deeply troubling is that neither side wants to compromise or even discuss compromise. They're like, fuck that. That's for cowards, weaklings, cucks, whatever the other side, the left-wingers call it. Oh yeah, we don't negotiate with Nazis, right? That's what they talk about, right? And on the right, it would basically be we don't cuck out, right? It's the same thing. It's intransigence. It's an inability or unwillingness to talk to the other side. I mean, I've made efforts to talk to the other side, and my problem is I talk to the other side, and they refuse to acknowledge some of the ridiculousness of their own side, okay? You have to be able to acknowledge some of the stupidity on your side before you can kind of have any kind of reconciliation, right? If you don't acknowledge the stupidity and foolishness of your side and say, yeah, that's a little too far, sorry about that, then the other side is not going to have any kind of incentive to do the same. To say, yeah, you know, if like I'm talking to like, I talked to the Bronx blogger, for instance, okay? He refused to accept, a better example, Christy Winters. I like Christy Winters on a personal level, and she's delightful, right? And I talked to her, right, about a very specific thing. I asked her, where is the definition? Where's the bright line where somebody can be deplatformed? It's a very, very simple question. She refused to answer that very simple question. And basically her answer was, well, whenever it bothers me. That was her basic answer. Yeah. Okay. Now, her inability or unwillingness to simply say, yeah, you know, this thing of like deplatforming, yeah, we have to figure out a way where some speech we don't like and we don't think that it should be allowed or given a megaphone. And this is the line. You know, her unwillingness to identify a line makes me unwilling to say, yeah, you know, some of these guys who are talking about like fascism is a good deal and maybe democracy sucks. Yeah, maybe they're a little bit too far, you know. Makes me unwilling to do that, okay? Because why should I? Because, you know, she's unwilling to to stop something that is inherently foolish that's coming from her side. She's unwilling to say, no, this is dumb. My side is saying something stupid. No, she will not do that. So why should I do that on my side for my guys?
I completely, exactly. And I think there's the opposite thing that could happen, which is what I'm feeling. And I see it. I'll give the story from the Civil War, and I'll try to articulate why I think it's important. There were guys, like, it's funny, you could accuse me of lost cause, if you will, but I just love listening to stories about Robert E. Lee. Mm-hmm. And before the Civil War, like literally right before, days before he goes south, he's admitting, like, look, slavery is a disaster. The institution itself, you know, I don't want this to exist, nor would I ever want to see it continue. But there are exceeding circumstances at play that I cannot have that argument with the North, because the North has taken acts of aggression against my homeland. And so in the greater scheme of things, regardless of my opinions on slavery, I go with my homeland.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel right now, which is I can say, you know, things on the right that bother me. Yeah. We've hinted at it earlier in this episode. But when you, basically I'm like, I'm going with the homeland. Yeah. Is what I'm kind of, yeah. I'm like Lee at this point. Yeah. I cannot, the situation on the other side has become so egregious that I cannot, in good consciousness, acquiesce.
Yeah, exactly. My thinking is that, the lefties, they're out of their fucking minds, and the more sensible and thoughtful are unwilling to, pull back. They give them their head. They just say, run. They say to the crazies, to the Ocasio-Cortezes and people like that, they say, run. Be free. Say and do whatever crazy, stupid ass shit you want to. And I think that this is a fucking disaster because, see, you and I are, okay, fuck it. We're smart guys. We have a fairly thoughtful opinion. You might disagree or agree with what we say, but if you disagree, you recognize that what we're saying, for the most part, is sensible and thought out. It's not just coming out of our ass, right? We're not saying, whatever the fuck. Right? We're saying things that have a little bit of logic and reason behind it, okay? And a little bit of historical thought behind it. Oh shit! And I lost the point of where the fuck I was going. What the fuck was I saying? Benway, you saved me. I was like trying to.
And on that note, let's. That's how I'm saving you this time. No. I get what you. So there's. It's one thing, and I've said this before. Look, disagreement is not the problem.
No.
People can disagree with me, and it's not like. And I think what you were trying to articulate is we're not necessarily, I mean, just pulling shit out of our ass to make a
right. That was the point I was trying to make. Sorry about that.
We're not trying to make the one constant political argument of reforming the society all the time.
No.
At least, sometimes we have our bugaboos, but I would say, I think we're trying to operate in a good consciousness and with a certain degree of honesty. We may be wrong, or we may make wrong, conclusions, but I think we're operating on honesty. I don't think that can be said of others.
Yeah.
And particularly, in these days, I accuse the other side of this more than our side. Maybe that's unfair, but that's certainly how I see it. I know that the people on the other side are not going to give a fucking inch. And I know they don't give a flying fuck about, manners and rising above.
Yes.
You can bitch about not wanting, what does owning the libs get you? It's like, because the libs own us, you fucking faggot. That's.
Yeah. Well, that was the point I was trying to make. Sorry, guys, listening to this, that I lost my train of thought. But it was just like, we are willing to talk. We are willing to compromise. We are actually fairly moderate people, okay? But when there's no possibility of just ceding a little ground on things that are self-evidently sane, okay? Look, this issue with Christy Winters really affected me in the sense that I genuinely wanted to know, what is that line? Where is that line? And she would never pinpoint it, because it's really situational, but that means it's arbitrary. It's whatever bothers her. Or let me rephrase that. Whatever she thinks, whatever the left thinks will be effective, that must be deplatformed. And that, you're basically saying, oh, it's not that you're disagreeing on principles. You're trying to shut me up. And that, of course, leads you to conclude, oh, you want to shut me up because you're afraid that I might be right. Because why do you want to shut somebody up? You never bother with somebody who's obviously wrong. You bother with somebody if they're obviously right. I mean, if somebody's saying something that's completely off the wall, you just let them. You just ignore them because you got better shit to do. But you deplatform somebody who might be right. That's why they deplatform people like that we don't particularly like, Milo and Ben Shapiro, right? I don't like him, right, at all. But between Milo and Ben Shapiro, yeah, sure, I'll put on the Shapiro shirt and the Yiannopoulos shirt before I give an inch to a fucking lefty faggot who won't let them talk, right? Obvious. And I'm a moderate,
And here's the thing, and I think you've already alluded to it. I'll just underline it. The reason, in my mind, she refused to tell you what the line is because there's power in the arbitrariness.
Yeah.
She refuses to concede the ability to decide at will who should not talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that should tell you everything you need to know about rising above.
Yeah. Yeah. It's ultimately an issue that they don't want to give up the power to disqualify anybody. Yeah. And so that is tyrannical. And so, yeah, we have to look at it in those terms, that the left has become tyrannical. Or I insist, actually, I don't think it's the left. It's that the radical left that is tyrannical has grown because of the economic problems that are affecting the Western democracies. The fact that the Western democracies decide to export its manufacturing base destroyed the middle class. And nobody on either side of the political aisle in positions of power, the Laborites or the Tories, the Republicans or the Democrats, who all agree on neoliberal economic policies, none of them are willing to accept the fact that it was catastrophic. Ross Perot was right. It would kill the American middle class. Ross Perot said this in 1992. He was right. And well, now here we have what we have. I think that actually that election was the key one, by the way. I think that that's the one that retrospectively people will say that was it. The fact that Ross Perot had such headway, I think that was the last gasp of people being affected by the negatives of the neoliberal economic paradigm, trying to play conventional politics. I think they went underground, and they just, and it's festering. You know what I mean? It's
Well, there were two voices actually in the '92 election.
Buchanan.
Pat Buchanan as well, because Pat actually made a fair amount of headway early on.
Yeah.
Challenging Georgie Porgy.
Yeah.
There. Well, I usually use Georgie Porgy for George Jr. But needless to say, that was the sentiment. And I kind of joke with a friend of mine. I joke on the beauty, this is foolhardiness, but whatever, indulge me. The beauty of an alternative reality when we could have gotten a string of Buchanan, Perot, and Ron Paul presidencies, and how the pipe dream, but it would have been the America First wet dream.
Yeah,
it never was going to happen, never meant to be. But these things have a tendency, to your point, go underground. If there's truth to it, it outs itself. The truth outs itself. Trust me.
I think that the one, I get a lot of comments about Obama, and the hatred of Obama is palpable, right? And my thinking is that when Obama hit the scene in 2008, I think that a lot of whites voted for him because they genuinely thought that he could be a vehicle for change.
Yes.
Okay. I myself thought so at the time, but when I heard him speak in Iowa, I thought this guy's the second coming of Jesus Christ when he won the Iowa caucus in 2008, beating Hillary Clinton, right? I thought this guy is it. He's the shit, right? But then shortly thereafter, there was the issue of few people would call this the Jeremiah Wright controversy, where this preacher that he had gone to had said some things that were, inflammatory, lefty and stuff, and Obama threw him under the bus instantly in a very polished speech that the Washington Post carried, and said nice things about.
I remember.
So, yeah. And that's when I knew that this guy was just another Clintonista. This guy would say anything to get to power. He didn't believe in anything. He didn't have any principle whatsoever. He was just another machine politician. He was a Clinton machine politician, right? And ultimately, everybody that he populated in his administration were Clintonistas, right? My thinking is that that political dissent that expressed itself in support for Perot, in support for what you call it, the Pat Buchanan, who supported Newt Gingrich until Gingrich swerved off the rails, right? That crowd supported Obama, and they became disillusioned over the 8 years of his presidency, and they turned to Trump. I don't quite understand why the establishment and the mainstream media is so surprised that people who voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 would have voted for Trump today. I'm surprised that they're surprised. They don't seem to realize that, or perhaps they're so cynical that they always realize that Obama was peddling bullshit and that there was really no hope in change, and that the people who voted for him because they thought that he was actually going to bring change. You see what I'm saying?
Well, here's the thing. It's a good question. My response to it has consistently been that the elite people don't think because they think that because they're elites, their thinking has already been done for them.
Yeah.
They already earned their position.
They outsourced it.
Well, I think there's some seriousness to this. I think they really look, because we're elite, our gut reaction is always right. And our gut belief that whatever we say is accurate is fine. And so if there's a shock to our system, well, how did this happen? I honestly think, and this will be the populist in me, funny enough, because I generally historically have not been much of a populist, I suppose. The populist in me does say, though, that I think average people think about things a lot more clearly than people in an elite situation are, because people in an elite situation have things ready-made for them. They're complacent. When things go easy for you, you go easy on yourself. And when you go easy on yourself, you get lazy.
Yeah. And so on that cheery note, we're going to call it a podcast because we've been going on for almost an hour and a half, boring you guys silly probably. But yeah, so tell us what you think in the comment section below. Look, I recommend the Civil War documentary. It's very good. And it's a very nice and painless way to absorb a lot of information about the Civil War. So yeah, I think it's fine. For all my critiques at the opening of the show, but yeah.
And one thing I will also say, in addition to the documentary, for those who are willing to do a deeper cut, as it were, like what they say for albums, like introduction and then the deep cuts. For those who have the time and the willingness, I really do recommend Shelby Foote's Civil War narrative. It is 3 volumes. They're big. It's going to take you a while. But why I recommend it is at a time in historiography when everybody is obsessed with sociology and the numbers of things, and they fundamentally dehumanized history. And Shelby Foote's book is old history and the oldest tradition of people who do deeds, and those deeds have consequences. And I really recommend it.
Yeah. I haven't read it myself, but I will be reading it. Yeah, because Shelby Foote was the best thing about the documentary. Really, his presence was just fantastic. So anyway, on that cheerful note, this is Coach Red Pill signing off for the Coach and Benway podcast. Thank you so much for listening to us, and we will see you next time.
Take it easy.